I'd also like to start by echoing Jane's earlier acknowledgement. I'm zooming in from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, so in Melbourne, and want to really acknowledge First Nations people's rich history of sharing knowledge, caring for country, and arts and cultural practice. As Claire pointed out, I'm really going to focus on from my disciplinary perspective, which is arts and cultural management, and really look at some case studies from my PhD research on the topic of creative recovery, and really trying to respond to this question around what do disaster affected communities value about engaging in the arts as part of their recovery. This is a quote from Pauline in Lobethal, South Australia. Having these art classes, I think they just saved my mental health. And this is a theme that's come up a few times in my research around this idea of the arts saving people in post-disaster contexts. I met with Pauline and 5 other people in the Adelaide Hills, which was affected by the Cuddly Creek bushfires in December 2019. And I also met with 10 community members in Cardinia Shire in Victoria, and they were affected by the Bunyip Complex fires in March 2019. Both of these communities participated in creative recovery projects that were initiated by local government. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring these 2 examples together is because although there are lots of grassroots examples, I think it can be helpful for government agencies, even peak bodies in the arts and cultural sector, to think about how they might be able to instigate or contribute to this field. Before I share more about those couple of case studies, I thought I'd just provide a bit more background on creative recovery for context. So as I mentioned, my discipline's arts and cultural management, and the peak body for creative recovery in the cultural sector is, of course, the Creative Recovery Network. So they define creative recovery as community-led arts programs that create supportive participatory outcomes for people living in disaster environments. And the Creative Recovery Network really looks at the whole of emergency management cycle. So that's really asking, what is the role of the arts in planning and preparing for disasters? What about in the response phase? What about in recovery? And then how do we build future resilience for disasters through arts and culture as well? But to date, there's been very little academic research in this field, as Claire's pointed out, and especially in the Australian context, there's a real paucity of literature. But I've looked at some industry reports and project documentation, which provides pretty compelling evidence that creative recovery can produce psychosocial benefits in disaster-affected communities. I wanted to give you a sense of how creative recovery as a field has evolved in Australia over the past 15 years, because I think that gives us a really useful foundation for understanding what directions we're heading in. Probably a lot of you are already aware that following Black Saturday, Creative Victoria and Regional Arts Victoria administered a statewide funding program for arts recovery projects. And arguably, this program is what kickstarted awareness in Australia of the benefits of the arts as part of disaster recovery. And the images on this slide are from grassroots projects in the small town of Strathewen, which is about an hour out of Melbourne. And on the left, you'll see an image from the Chook project by Barbara Joyce. And on the right is the Letterbox project by Marion Oakley. And both artists lived in Strathewen and initiated these projects very soon after the fires. And they established informal arts groups that met regularly, and they eventually sought funding for materials as their projects gained momentum. So that's quite a common model in creative recovery, that there's these small, simple and humble offerings from community members that then grow over time in response to community interest. And these 2 groups working on the 2 projects eventually merged to form an ongoing arts and crafts group that continues to meet weekly in Strathewen to this day. Which I think is really lovely example of the legacy of these kinds of projects. And of course, on a larger scale, these are sort of memorial examples. On the left, it's the Strathewen Bushfire Memorial, and that was commissioned by their local community recovery committee, who really recognised that this would be beneficial to the wider community and involved a lot of community consultation. And on the right is a branch from the Blacksmiths Tree, which was a project led by Amanda Grant and the Blacksmiths Association, that engaged with community over a period of 5 years before concluding with the installation of a 9.8 metre tall metal tree sculpture. Moving on to 2010-11, when the Queensland floods and Cyclone Yasi happened, or, the sort of really big floods before the more recent ones, three of the most heavily impacted local government areas were included in a creative recovery pilot project. And that project was funded by the Australia Council for the Arts, now Creative Australia, Arts Queensland, and 4 non-government arts organisations. And those projects really aimed to build local capacity and networks, and they were really designed to target community members that are typically underserviced in disaster recovery. So those are groups like children and young people, older people, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So really responding there to a lot of the points that Claire raised in terms of what's available in the literature. This project was managed by Scotia Monkovich and led to the establishment of the Creative Recovery Network. And there are several well-documented examples from this period onwards, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to move through to some more recent examples following Black Summer. These are really well-documented examples, so I won't spend too much time talking about them. Just to point out that this is another example of a grassroots project led by Jessica Brown in Beachmont. Happens to be an experienced arts manager and artist, and so her projects in Beachmont after the 2019 fires in the Scenic Rim really prioritised local employment and for artists, and also really great governance structures. So that's a really useful example for that kind of the sophistication of creative recovery projects on the ground. Another example that I wanted to draw your attention to is Arbor Festival. This was a 50-day-long anniversary festival following on from Black Summer that was led by Vanessa Keenan. And it involved arts exhibitions, circus performers, and live music, among other art forms. And it was also supported by the not-for-profit organisation Eastern Riverina Arts. So there's a trend in Australia of these peak not-for-profit organisations supporting the delivery of these kinds of projects as well. And of course, there are many, many other examples of creative recovery following Black Summer. But I did want to move on to one example following the recent floods in northern New South Wales in the Northern Rivers. And here there's an organisation called the Creative First Aid Alliance. And this is a group of local artists and arts workers who have established a community of practice to essentially support one another to deliver these kinds of projects for communities. So the artists themselves are really focused on producing outcomes for their communities and supporting one another to do this really important but quite challenging and demanding work. And one of my favourite examples is the Rescue exhibition, which was led by Jonty Sinclair, who's on the right-hand side. She interviewed civilian rescuers in the Northern Rivers. So some of you may be familiar with that in Lismore, civilians were rescuing one another from rooftops throughout the floods, and she interviewed a lot of those rescuers and exhibited their portraits and stories locally in Lismore. There are some examples. On the slide, you'll see some of the points that have come through as best practice in creative recovery. And there's a report that the Creative Recovery Network and Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, FRRR, developed that speaks to these points in a bit more detail. But essentially, best practice in creative recovery is either community-led or involves quite extensive community engagement, long-term embedment of artists, and is usually involves professional artists and arts workers. It goes across a range of different art forms and can really strengthen cross-sector and intergovernmental partnerships, as well as be strengthened by those sorts of partnerships. And we also know from industry reports that these are some of the psychosocial benefits or some of the justification for funding these kinds of projects from Black Saturday through to now. So there's a kind of acceptance that the arts in post-disaster context can help communities build and restore connections. So that's the social capital piece. Create these lasting memorials. It's a way of sharing stories, contributing to a culture of generosity in communities, and enhancing psychological and physiological health, among a few other things. In my research, I'm really trying to bring together that academic literature and industry reports and conduct empirical research through interviews, focus groups, and observations. Today, I'm going to focus on a couple of focus groups to see what community members themselves have identified as the benefits of engaging in the arts as part of their recovery. So in Cardinia Shire, I conducted a focus group with 10 people who'd engaged in one of two or sometimes both projects following March 2019 fires, so prior to Black Summer. Cardinia Shire local government initiated this project and worked with Creative Recovery Network, who delivered local advice and training to 3 artists who were selected to lead projects. These projects were called A Singing Thing, and that was a choir project developed in partnership with Stephen Taberner from the Spooky Men's Chorale, and that involved regular choir rehearsals and public performances. And Stephen helped the community write a song about their experience of the Bunyip Complex fires. And they then performed that song for their community and recorded the song to a CD for posterity. And then there were also a series of Core 10 steel panels or sculptures, and they were developed by Sue Jarvis and Janine Good, who featured wildlife and vegetation from the local area. In the Adelaide Hills, I met with 6 participants, all of whom were women, and 3 of whom had experienced what they referred to as total loss, so lost their properties, homes, and contents. And they had all participated in a range of different workshops delivered by Fabric Arts and Heritage, and they're a local arts hub owned and operated by council. And they produced recovery programs for over 3 years following the fires. And participants in the focus group there identified an enormous range of projects. One of them was called New Art, New Walls, which was a family painting workshop where they created an artwork to be hung on newly rebuilt walls. So for people who'd lost their homes, this was a project for them to make artworks with their family members as well. And there were a whole range of other examples there. And despite the differences across these 2 projects, there were quite a lot of similarities in the benefits identified by participants across those 2 groups. So one benefit, of course, was that emotional expression and catharsis, and that's also supported by research in the field of arts therapy. But unlike arts therapy, creative recovery is less explicitly therapeutic. And participants identified that this not being explicitly therapeutic was a way, helped people feel like they didn't have to talk about the fires if they didn't want to. So they saw that as a benefit. But over time, participants said that they felt safe and comfortable expressing their emotions as part of these programs. And they thought that conversations wouldn't have been as enriching if they hadn't been keeping their hands busy through visual arts and crafts activities. So that was a benefit too. Keeping their hands busy meant that they could speak more openly. This was mirrored in the Cardinia Shire. Danny said that the singing thing drew out emotion in people that you just didn't know was in there. And that essentially it wouldn't have come out any other way, that these conditions uniquely made them feel safe to express those kinds of emotions. And they found it really cathartic, both contributing to writing the song and also performing that for their wider community. Some of the members of this choir have continued to seek out other choir singing opportunities, and they've really valued how participating in a choir has helped them recognise what their own recovery needs were. Of course, communities really valued that opportunity to connect. They found that connections were more important than anything else about their recovery process. And they also said that it helped them in Cardinia Shire, helped form connections across the community. So they were lots of separate different townships. And then through this project, they felt more connected to the different townships and also felt that they developed friendships with the artists themselves. And that was really important to them. And it was a source of pride and hope for their community. And that sense of pride was echoed in the hills, in the Adelaide Hills, in relation to the New Art, New Walls example. And they said that it was probably the first of those kinds of activities that had that message of hope or that message of moving on, which they really valued. They also felt that exhibiting those paintings locally promoted connection within the community between those who had lost their homes and those who hadn't. And in the disaster research literature, it talks about, there's a lot of conversation about this, these hierarchies of affectedness, these comparisons that happen between people who have been affected in different ways within a community by certain disasters. So that's a really useful finding, that the arts can promote those connections specifically. They also felt that fabric in the Adelaide Hills helped them develop relationships within their communities that felt safe and secure. They especially advocated for the continuation of creative recovery programs beyond the 3-year period, which is when they ended. And participants acknowledged that the arts were probably the longest staying recovery process in their community. So mental health support and other forms of recovery support were being withdrawn well before arts programs were concluding. And they really valued the presence of those arts activities, and that they were free because they were more accessible, and that made people more likely to participate. And they also really valued that the quality of art materials and the professionalism and interpersonal skills of the artists, because those things made participants feel really valued in their engagement in the arts. And of course, these interpersonal skills and the professionalism was really important for overcoming initial skepticism or reluctance to participate. So that's something that's come through quite a few times. But participants have said that the terrier-like tenacity of artists and the authentic engagement in the approach has really helped win people over. So overall, this is a summary of the findings of what communities value about the arts as part of their recovery: regular access to safe environments for emotional expression, being around others who have experienced the same thing, a process that strengthens bonds, a source of pride and hope, identifying their own personal recovery needs, options for continued local participation, and long-term presence and responsiveness of artists and arts workers. And so this is all part of my PhD thesis research, and there's some other research outcomes that I've been working towards. And yeah, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at anna.kennedy@unimel.edu.au. Thanks.